Lucy Powell, Matt Hancock says he's sorry, he's let people down, and he's gone. Shouldn't that be the end of it?
Well, I'm afraid this goes to the judgment and the leadership of the Prime Minister as well, because Matt Hancock, yes, it's good that he's now gone, but he should have gone on Friday and the Prime Minister should have sacked him. And these are the difficult decisions of leadership. And I'm afraid it feels to me like the Prime Minister has a very dangerous blind spot when it comes to issues of integrity and conduct in public life. And that's a really big problem. And it's even bigger problem when you're in the middle of a pandemic and you're asking the public to also have integrity and conduct in the way that they go about with their own lives.
Are you going to oppose the severance payment to which Mr. Hancock is statutorily entitled? I think it comes out at something like £18,000.
Well, I think most of your viewers would be appalled to think that there's going to be a severance payment to Matt Hancock in this circumstance. Let's not forget, he, as the Health Secretary, was the guy who recommended that our NHS workers, after the year that they've just had in this pandemic on the front line, who have worked flat out, who are now on their knees, he recommended that they in effect had a pay cut. And I think to find out that he's now going to get thousands of pounds as some kind of severance redundancy payment for, frankly, being caught on the job while he was on the job, I think would be pretty disgusting to most people. And we will certainly be calling that out and asking the Prime Minister not to give him that.
Well, we don't know whether Mr. Hancock wants to claim it or not. So to be fair, it's at the moment hypothetical. But to get an idea of how far you want to press this, when Professor Neil Ferguson conducted an extramarital affair, Mr. Hancock was one of his most vociferous critics. And actually, he said that he supported the call for a police inquiry. Do you think that the police should look into Mr. Hancock's behaviour?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that very well. Could you just say that again? It was something about a police inquiry, yeah?
Of course. I'm trying to work out how far Labour wants to push this. When Neil Ferguson ran into trouble, Mr. Hancock supported a call for a police inquiry. And I'm just wondering whether Labour would do the same in this situation.
Well, my colleague, Fleur Anderson, has referred this to the police because she wants to know, we want to know, whether the police will be looking at whether Matt Hancock did break the law in his actions. At the time, you'll remember, when this video was taken, we were all told that we could only have close contact with those that we were in a bubble with. They were our bubble. And that was the only people we could have close contact with. That was the law at the time. Yet it now turns out that Matt Hancock was actually in two bubbles at the same time, unbeknown to other people in that bubble. And that is how infection spreads. So, yes, there are serious issues here which need further investigation, and we will be looking at those because, of course, Matt Hancock was the first to say that Neil Ferguson and others should have resigned when they broke the rules and that other people needed to abide by them. So you can't have the rule maker also being the rule breaker. People want to know there's accountability in that.
The government obviously wants to limit this to an issue of one individual's conduct. But I think from what Labour leaders have been saying, you think that this is endemic in government. And I just want to pick up on a couple of the points that you've made. You've said that Mrs. Coladangelo is an old university friend of Mr. Hancock's, appointed as a non-executive at the Department of Health. But, of course, that point was cleared by the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health. Why go after them on that basis?
Well, look, I think there seem to be widespread issues here. As I say, the Prime Minister seems to have a really dangerous blind spot when it comes to these issues. We now also find out that Matt Hancock was using his own private Gmail account to undertake effectively negotiations and discussions about very large NHS contracts. That comes on top of other questions relating to Michael Gove, Priti Patel and others about the handing out of government contracts. And so, yes, there are some very serious issues here that seem to cut across the whole of government about how government contracts, government paid for jobs are being handed out and whether they're being done in accordance with those Nolan principles of public life and in accordance with the ministerial code of conduct, which I'm afraid the Prime Minister seems to disregard whenever it suits him. It's not really worth the paper it's written on at the moment. And so, yes, we will be pursuing those wider issues, and there are those wider issues across government.
It is, of course, the role of the opposition to point out the government's failings, to scrutinise it, to point out the issues of cronyism, charmocracy, all that kind of thing. But what would you do to change that? I mean, presumably, if you're making the case that this is characteristic of the whole government and not just a couple of one-off problems, there is something systemic that has to be tackled here. So what is that, and what would Labour actually do about it?
Well, I think it does speak to who does the Conservative Party represent here, in whose interests are they governing? Are they governing in the interests of a lot of their wealthy donors, their mates in business looking to make a fast buck off the public sector? Or are they governing in the interests of ordinary working people who are trying to get by in this country, who need decent pay, decent housing and decent jobs? And it feels to me time and time again that this Conservative Party, I'm afraid, are governing in the interests of their wealthy friends, and that's when it gets found out. So yes, it's not just about your processes and whether you've got strong leadership. And I absolutely believe that Keir Starmer would have sacked Matt Hancock or if it had been any one of us in this situation on the spot, and how you deal with them. But it's also about in whose interests are you governing, in whose interests are you a politician? And that's where the Labour Party and the Conservative Party really have quite a big difference, I think.
You say that Keir Starmer would have done this differently and been decisive and all that. But look, you're confronted with a government against whom you can and have made over many months credible charges of hypocrisy, sleaze, cronyism and sheer incompetence. Yet you managed to lose a by-election in a previously safe seat last month. You're in danger of losing another one this week, and you're way behind in the polls. How can that possibly be? I mean, how do you manage that? Well,
look, the by-election on Thursday has not happened yet. We've got a fantastic local candidate in Kim Ledbetter, who is a very passionate local community activist. She's not really a politician at all, and we'll be fighting for every vote on Thursday. So let's see what happens there. But of course, in a pandemic, it's not a time of politics as usual. People want to see the government succeed. We want to get back to life as normal, and we have to take a slightly different approach as the opposition. People don't want to just hear from us in terms of opposition for opposition's sake. They want to see us being constructive and working where we need to, working with the government to end this pandemic so we can all move on. And we're emerging out of that, I hope, soon. And, I think you'll hear a lot more from Labour over the coming months about how we'll deal with some of those underlying issues that this pandemic has exposed, the gross inequality in this country, in health, in wealth and in our public services.
One very quick last question, if I may. Sunday Times this morning says that some Labour figures are trying to persuade Tony Blair to stand for Parliament again. Might there be some Labour hearts going pitter-patter at the prospect of the return of the old boss?
I don't think so, no. We've got a very good leader in Keir Starmer, and we are all united behind him. We've got that T-shirt. We've watched that movie before where we turn in on ourselves and focus on these other issues, and that movie doesn't end well for Labour. So we are focused on being united and getting behind Keir Starmer so that we can put forward that compelling, radical, big offer to the country that we need to do at the next election.